Welcome, Charles, and thanks so much for joining us up here today. So you've been extremely busy at this year's conference. I think that's an understatement. You started off presenting at a pre-conference on the future of the academic book. So from your perspective and what you've heard, what is the future of the academic book? Does it have a future, and what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think it's extremely rosy. That was an extremely good session, that first session. And Peter Brantley, who's just such a great thinker in this space, really broke down the issues very, very nicely and the opportunities. So one of the big opportunities at the moment is different ways of funding the production of academic books, particularly a lot of initiatives around open access books. And those imaginative funding opportunities open other possibilities. And so his second bucket was around technology and formats. So just this opportunity to sort of use the openness of the book to make it fully part of the networked environment is very, very exciting. So, you know, the work that is now happening within the W3C, which has recently taken over control of the EPUB standard, to really bring the book into a fully web-enabled, enhanced, annotated type of space that's just going to be native to anybody who's working on the web is super exciting. And of course, it's enabled by those new funding models, so everything's connected. And then the third area that he talked about is a more problematic area, but it's kind of exciting for really geeky people, which is the one about rights. And a lot of what's been holding back books has been a lot of lack of clarity around third-party permissions, inserts of various sorts, and you know what you can do with these materials in the digital space. But there's really interesting work being done by people like Lisa Macklin at Emory about pushing the boundaries of fair use and new forms of contract and new forms of agreement. An awful lot of the work is traceable back to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who's really invested a lot of energy in the future of the book. And there are also exciting parallel projects happening in Europe, the Hermios project in the EU. And there's a lot going on, and it's really exciting because the book, the container of the book has been restricting so many disciplines. And my background's in archaeology, and it's never been a good container for archaeological reports. And to see them really sort of finding their own sort of containers in this digital space is super exciting.
I'm so glad that there's a future for the book.
It sounds like it includes multimedia, enhanced ebooks. And
It does, and a lot of the focus of Mellon's funding has been on platforms, because one of the things that was very clear from that session is you really can't distinguish the content from the platform anymore. These are working together as a system. So we've been working at Michigan leading a project called Fulcrum, which is really about that embedding multimedia, and not only embedding it, but making sure that a press and a library, presses and libraries can work together to make sure that any multimedia that's embedded also passes down into a preservation infrastructure. And so that's another thing that's happening. I mean, these new forms of book-like object are really changing the ways that publishers and libraries can work together.
that's interesting. Now, as far as this future that we're talking about, what role do you see for a press like you as the University of Michigan Press? And what about the more commercial presses? And then, of course, where do libraries fit into the mix?
Yeah, so, I think that University of Michigan Press is really trying to get back to some of its roots, get back to the idea of being a values-based, non-profit, mission-driven publisher. And there's a reason that university presses are classified as non-profit in the tax code, and our job is to fill the gaps that the commercial market really can't handle for various reasons. So, I think that means being able and willing to experiment and take some risks in terms of format that's going to be much harder if you always have to look over your shoulder for the next dollar. There's a very strong focus on diversity that's really growing in university presses. There's a lot of interest in the idea of bringing voices from the margins and also opening access to people who might not otherwise have access to this information. And that's an extremely values-based, getting back to values sort of activity. And then there's a lot of excitement in a lot of university presses, I think, about becoming even more deeply embedded in certain disciplinary communities. And most presses are now very, very focused maybe on 5 or 6 subject areas. And they're finding opportunities to really embed themselves even more in those. So fairly specific activities. So how does that match with the commercial publishers? I think the opportunity for distinctiveness is around being embedded and niche and experimental and values-based in a period where there's such a lot of consolidation within the commercial publishing space, which is all about scale and similarity and common infrastructure and common formats. And you really need that sort of replicability to actually make that work. And there isn't a lot of space for the thing that doesn't fit. So, even though there's huge innovation in the commercial publishing space, ultimately some of this niche experimentation just doesn't work with the scale side of things. And then the library role, I think there is, there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of opportunity around preservation. The area of these enhanced, media, that's a really big opportunity for library press collaboration. But also, this conference has had so much on discovery, and also the important role of filtering as well. So there's a lot of new roles and relationships.
It's exciting.
Yeah, and I'm so glad to hear too that there's consciousness of diversity and of sort of a global access model here, because I think sometimes we forget that there is a certain luxury in being able to even grapple with these issues themselves. So I'm glad to hear that.
I do think on the luxury, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that really became very, very clear in some of the recent work looking at the costs of producing books is just how much cost university presses have, how much investment they have embedded in the acquisitions function. And it's really striking, university press acquisitions editors usually have targets like 20, 25 books a year. A commercial publishing equivalent has a 65, 70 books a year. So the acquisitions editors in our presses are really needing to sort of double down on thinking about what they can do that's more time consuming that others can't do. And a lot of that is about helping a voice that wouldn't otherwise be heard to be heard. Because there's a lot of hand-holding, there's a lot of finding those voices and then developing the work. And I think university presses are at their best when they have a story, like we have an editor who recently produced a book called Butch Queen Up in Pumps. And it's about the queer dance scene in Detroit. And the author is somebody who was a drag queen, who then went back to school and got his PhD, in fact. But this editor started working with him 10 years ago and worked with him throughout this whole process. And that book is an amazing insight into a culture that many of us don't know very well. And it's expensive to have an editor working for that long with that sort of
That's quite a commitment.
project. But that's when the university presses are at their best.
So Charles, you also participated in a workshop that discussed areas where cooperation between publishers and libraries could work to benefit both. So were there examples of this mutually beneficial cooperation that jumped out at you from the session?
So the Charleston Conference has always been this amazing venue for publishers and librarians to meet, but also this third group, the infomediaries, the intermediaries, the jobbers, all these companies who are embedded in this space. And of course, many of the people who work for those companies sort of come in and out of the publisher library space throughout their careers. So what was really striking me was the conversation that's happening at the moment that involves all three parties around the discovery of open access content. And it has to be a collaborative activity. And there are so many things, especially around open access books, to be sorted out in the standard space, in just understanding workflows and handoffs. So that was really exciting as a building conversation at this whole conference, not just in that workshop. So I think there's a lot there.
Yeah, thanks.
Was there anything in particular that you learned that the University of Michigan Press could apply directly to your library customers?
Yes. In that specific space of open access discovery, there is a lot of interesting and deeply technical stuff about the translation of Onyx into Mark. And I don't even pretend to understand the details of this, but I'm definitely taking some of these observations back to my colleagues in technical services. There is this very, very well-formed Onyx for open access standard, and it's well documented, and we and other publishers are using it and have been using it. But the problem is we can send it out, but it's not being received, and it's not being picked up by vendors properly, and also with a library culture that uses Mark, it's not being translated into Mark satisfactorily by and there's really room for organizations like OCLC to do more on this. So that was really interesting. So, pretty specific stuff.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that. As far as working with library customers, do you think it helps you as a press that is so closely associated with a library yourself, as a part of the library publishing coalition? And I mean, has that helped you out as far as dealing with your library customers?
It does, and it enables us to do more. I mean, on the one hand, I know exactly who to go to when I get back, because I see Martin at parties, we mix, we mingle, there's no distance. But also it enables us as an institution to put a little bit of pressure on both sides, because University of Michigan Library has a very large acquisitions budget, and when we call Coots listens when we call them as a library, and if we can also provide samples of material at the other end, then we can sort of see how the two things join up. So I think there's such a lot of opportunity to improve workflows, engage with supply chain issues, engage with issues for a press embedded in a library to actually, improve the situation for others, not to be too sort of grandiloquent about it.
So another topic you've discussed this year is the Open Access Monograph Publishing Initiative, and this was the Lively Lunch discussion that I attended yesterday, and or OMP, I think. Is that also,
It's such a bad idea.
Is that going to catch on? Okay. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, OMP is an interesting initiative, and it was the whole idea for this initiative came out of conversations around 2014 between the Association of American Universities and the Association of Research Libraries around scholarly communication in general. And there were two reports. One was around the issues of journals, and the other one was around the issues of books. And one of the proposals that came out of the conversation about books was the idea of the potential to sort of ultimately flip the model for funding books with a number of ambitions embedded in there. And a major one was to make sure that humanities research really made it into the networked environment, and that humanities scholarship wasn't lost, and that humanities scholars really had the reach and the impact that they needed. There was a sort of an ulterior motive, which was to engage with some of the challenges that university presses were facing economically as book budgets declined. So there's sort of quite a lot was in that initiative. And then over the next 3 years, that group continued to work and eventually came out with what is essentially a pilot project it's an experiment to just work through some of the issues that might exist in this kind of new model. And the pilot project involves 13 institutions at this point, large research institutions, and what they've each committed to do is to, drop some money in at the top of what Paul Courant, who is one of the major architects of the initiative, describes as this marble run, and then to see how that money sort of goes down the marble run in its various sort of different ways, and then what drops out of the bottom. And so the OAMPI project is a 5-year pilot project. Each of the 13 institutions have committed to $45,000 a year. And what they do is they make that money available as a grant fund for their faculty members to apply for. And they will award 3 grants a year. And that grant money will then be taken by the faculty member to a publisher who has already selected their book for publication, and the accepting publisher needs to make that book available open access. And it's a very distributed, deliberately distributed initiative. It has a very lightweight central governing structure, a steering committee, but everything is really left, almost everything is left to the individual institutions to work out, with the recognition that all these institutions have very, very different cultures, structures, ways of doing things. So it's going to be a fascinating project to study over the next 5 years. And already it's getting an awful lot of kind of buzz and discussion going. And, I think that was a lot of the idea, right? It's to get some often quite stormy discussion underway with the idea that this is good to be discussing this stuff. Yeah. And eventually we should end up with some good solutions.
One thing I really appreciated about that session was that it was presented as a series of questions. So instead of just, this is what we want to do and this is how we think we should do it, it was, what do you think we should be doing? Or, what are your thoughts on this? And so I really appreciated that it was something where we felt like we were contributing to your body of knowledge.
I think it was really interesting, that session as well, because of the way in which it brought up a number of new questions that we hadn't thought about before. There was one question, for example, which was about what happens if an author moves institution between the time that they've been awarded the money and the time that they publish the book. And that was one nobody had thought about. So this is where Charleston really comes into its own. It's in having these multi-stakeholder conversations and hosting them. And I think it would be really valuable for Charleston to keep involved in this initiative, because this is a classic initiative where publishers and libraries need to collaborate and are having some difficulty doing so. And there needs to be this kind of more sort of civilized discussion happening, and there are very few venues where that can happen.
Well, that leads to the next question about the need, or at least it seems to be a need, for a spirit of collaboration and experimentation. And I'm wondering if your observation of the project, if you have seen a whole lot of that, and if you could chat a little bit about that. But also, what do librarians, publishers, and the libraries, institutions, what do they need to do to make OA sustainable?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a sort of a disappointment in the OAMPI project, it's really around not a very good tradition of listening happening. I think one has to recognize that this is a pretty tense time for university presses and for libraries in the monograph space. I mean, not a lot of money to go around. And in tense times, people do tend to retreat into their camps and try and establish hard boundaries. And it's a fairly fragile initiative. And if one is too territorial on either side, if one isn't being listened to and heard for what one's saying, behind, listened to in one's own context, it could easily collapse. So, and I think we're really seeing some of that actually happening. There's quite a lot of storming happening around that initiative. And to really succeed in this very new way of thinking, there really has to be pretty deep appreciation of different agendas. This has been modeled very well at Emory University. So the Mellon Foundation has invested particularly in Emory because it's observed a culture of discussion between faculty members, and the librarians, and there's been some sort of publishing representation over quite a long period to really kind of understand where they're going and what the issues are here. And it's really, really important.
It sounds like one of the things that the project is enabling is that figuring this out, and so people are listening and trying to cooperate and encouraging experimentation.
They should be. They should be. And the problem is that they don't necessarily have that forum. Everybody's very busy with other things. And that was what was so great about the session yesterday, and why I hope that there can still be a forum for that conversation at Charleston, because it's now come down to, from the sort of dean and director level, it's come down now to the people who need to make it work. And one of the conclusions that came out of that meeting yesterday is, there were people in the room who are just trying to make it work. And now we need to get like a kind of an offline Google listserv or something going to connect those people so that other people don't have to posture too much. So.
Let's switch gears slightly. So institutional repositories are another interest of yours. Where do you think they fit into research workflows as faculty try to maximize the impact of their research?
They don't.
They don't? Oh, all right.
I mean, they're not. They should do. But too many of our institutional repositories are just not fitting into research workflows at all. I mean, they are extremely siloed at a period when everybody else is investing in trying to integrate systems. And, you see things like the Open Science Framework and lots of other initiatives dedicated to interoperability and to reducing faculty pain points. And you see a lot of institutional repositories sitting outside that environment. So it's really important that we concentrate on embedding our institutional repositories into those frameworks so that faculty don't even notice them. I mean, that they are just such an inevitable part of workflows that wherever the faculty start, and they'll start with the tools that they're familiar with, at some point the institutional repository may come into play and do what it's good at, but a faculty member will not even notice it. They'll just notice it through the impact that it brings.
Where is that going to come from, though? How do we, this isn't going to, I know that this isn't going to start with libraries. I mean, we can help, but we're not going to be the final say on this, and we're not going to be the ones who are somehow going to turn faculty's minds toward this concept that you're talking about. So, I mean, where is this going to come from? What's going to be the motivational factor?
Well, I think it is going to come from libraries in many cases. I think it's going to come from the recognition of the role that the library plays within the institution and through the connecting role it can play between different parts of the institution. So at an institution the size of Michigan, it's an extremely distributed environment with a lot of kind of apparent duplication of functions. And one of the only places that can recognize that and have relationships with a lot of different people is the library. And the library can play that role, and as it plays that role, it can be injecting its own resources, like the institutional repository, into those conversations. And then one has a lot of energy at the institutional level as a whole in terms of making those connections that then involve the institutional repository. A lot of those connections will involve bolting on to commercial systems. And there are a number of commercial providers who are eager to attach various interoperable bits to even these open source repositories. That brings in a whole new level of challenge for the library, as we've seen, and that challenge is not to get into an environment of proprietary lock-in. And one of the things the library can be very vigilant about on behalf of the institution is to make sure that in this new integrated workflow, the institution doesn't accidentally get into that situation where it is locked into one vendor's environment. So I think the library has a huge role to play here, and the institutional repository has become a bit of a nexus for that realization. And that often it's people who are IR managers who are pointing that out now. Yeah.
Well, as we've been talking, there seems to be still a fair amount of skepticism about the viability of IRs. And I'm wondering, you've kind of hinted at a few strategies that could be used, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and talk about ones that the University of Michigan has used to prove the skeptics wrong about IRs.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of soul searching around IRs in the US. I'm probably in Canada, but maybe less so. But I mean, what I do see is in the UK, in Australia, particularly, IRs have completely transformed themselves. I mean, the people who manage IRs are some of the most valued people on campus. They're playing an absolute crucial role in getting the university the money that it needs because they're able to aggregate information about faculty outputs. They are experts in the organization of information. It's also happening in other European countries like Scandinavia, the whole of Scandinavia. So, I mean, this soul searching is a bit of a US thing, I think. And what we're seeing now is a rapid rollout of research information management systems at our institutions. The huge growth of Symplectic and Elsevier Pure, and we see it in the vendor showcase. This is where a lot of focus is happening. And these are systems that have great potential to do this integration of the IR that we couldn't really do on our own. So I think that's this is the IR redux. This is the rebirth of the IR that we're seeing at the moment, as long as people are alert to the opportunities.
So it sounds like you have a positive perspective on that, just as you have a positive perspective on the future of the academic book.
I think it's very exciting. I think it's really, really important the library wakes up and realizes this. And I think it's interesting. We're seeing some interesting position descriptions starting to appear. Research information management, research impact librarians, for example, are starting to come up. And also interesting new roles for faculty, for subject liaisons. And this is not just a big university thing. I mean, I think in many ways, smaller institutions saw this coming a lot sooner. And, actually, B-Press and Digital Commons was an important player in this space with things like selected works and showing the opportunity of the library to sort of aggregate faculty output and student output and just really boost the reputation of the institution. And just one last thing there, I think there are danger spots in here that we need to really watch out for. And one of the proprietary lock-in, and the other is this delicate balancing act between the library being compliance cop versus partner. And, that's a delicate balancing act as we try and form partnerships with faculty to sort of really boost their research, to be collaborators. And we have to navigate the idea that we're looking over their shoulders and being kind of the agent of Big Brother there. So it's going to be a delicate balancing act with this RIM activity. And I really credit OCLC for taking a lot of leadership here. So Rebecca Bryant, who organized a session at this conference, wasn't able to be here. She's just running this fabulous special interest group within OCLC, which is doing wonderful work on helping the library understand how it will fit with research information management. Real leadership.
Well, Charles, we're not going to let you go without asking your prediction on the future of libraries and library education.
So I have a beef with library education. I don't have an MLS myself, and so I'm kind of, I'm a bit of a fraud to speak about it. But I've been around enough people with MLSs and talk enough with people who teach in library schools, people like Maria Bond, who I spoke to this morning. And what boggles my mind about this is the lack of any education about publishing. I mean, any education about publishing is entirely negatively framed. The education is essentially to poison the young minds, not so young minds, against publishing. And these institutions are thereby cutting the employment opportunities for their graduates in half. I mean,
That's a good point.
STM publishing alone is a $35 billion global industry. Why would you cut your graduates off from that? And we see at places like the Charleston conference, we see this mobility in reality between being working at a library, working at a vendor, working at a publisher, and we see this huge demand. I mean, University of Michigan Press, we have a huge demand for people with an understanding of the organization of information, with the understanding of metadata, with the all these things that librarians bring to the table, and library schools are actually doing a good job in educating people in. But why would you halve the opportunities for these graduates? And even iSchools. I mean, iSchools are pointing their graduates off towards the West Coast and towards Facebook and etc., and are completely ignoring the way that publishing has dramatically changed. So it's a huge gap.
Well, I think, and that's one of the reasons I think Katina founded the conference is because there's kind of almost an adversarial relationship between libraries and publishers. And the reason for this conference is to break that down and to foster the links among librarians, publishers, and vendors. So I think your points are well taken. Have you had any discussions with library educators where they see your point and are moving in another direction?
I don't see deans of library schools seeing this at all. I mean, there are definitely, people lower down teaching, like Maria Bonn, but I don't see any energy around this from any of the deans.
Maybe this is going to be something that is going to be the result of a sort of new emerging class of librarians coming up. My first job was with a vendor, and I was cautioned by people I really respected in the field that if I ever wanted to get back into the library, it was going to be very hard to come back because they would not want me to. They wouldn't want me from the vendor side. That's not been my experience at all. I think the narrative doesn't necessarily match up with the reality sometimes in that case, and that in fact I find that the skills at both sides, vendors and publishers would love to hire from libraries and vice versa. And so maybe there's going to be this new sort of crop of enlightened folks coming up who are going to be teaching in library schools in the future who have had that sort of experience and maybe see the value in it. I hope.
It all looks like a good program for the conference to have a discussion about this.
It'd be an interesting survey to do actually of conference attendees to find out more about their careers. And I think one might see a disproportionate number of people who've had these varied careers in a number of different places. But I think it's a really good, and it's so selfish of me because I work in Michigan publishing with several colleagues who are from library, who have MLSs. So Becky Welsenbach and Jason Coleman, who are here with me this year, are both MLSs. And, every day, one just realizes why that is an important thing.
Let me ask you one, and maybe this would be the last question. It's actually, what question should have we asked that we haven't asked? Is there a question that you would ask yourself that we've neglected to ask?
Gosh, that's a difficult one because, okay, so what? I think there's an interesting, there's something really difficult to work out going on around how libraries organize themselves. Organizational structure, it's something that's bugging us on an absolutely daily basis at Michigan, and we are failing to work out. And it's all around support for digital scholarship, support for research impact, support for research data, support for publishing services, support for all these new kinds of functional specialities, data visualization and so on. We're having such trouble working out where that lives, how to organize around a library that may have a pretty hierarchical structure, reporting up to AULs, team-based approaches, matrix organization. And I'm seeing that in library after library. And the place I don't see it so much is the smaller libraries. And, I've been traveling because of this other initiative, the Lever Press initiative, to a lot of liberal arts college libraries. And those are libraries that seem to be working well. And so I was recently at St. Olaf, for example, and Carleton. And it's like, it's just so refreshing to come from a big research library to a library where it's totally embedded in the work of the institution. Everybody appears to know what they should be doing and are daily getting kind of that feedback of satisfaction. We know why you're there. You're transforming yourself. You're not a collections library, you're a services library. But the research libraries are having such trouble with this. And I've seen very few of them managing this well.
We are in such a transformational time for libraries, moving from being perceived as collections and a place to being maybe perceived more as services or figuring out ways to provide unique and innovative services. And I agree, I think that's a difficult transition for folks to make.
Yeah, I think medical libraries have done some of the most interesting work, and we need a bit of that in the rest of the
special
research.
libraries like that have always had that service orientation. They have always moved in that direction.
I think probably a lot of it comes up when you have to deal with multiple disciplines. So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? But one of the particular jarring things is around this business about subject specialists and functional specialists. What does a handoff look like? And it would be easy if it was a linear thing. If we could train faculty that they need to go to their subject specialist and then they get gradually introduced into the workflow and they meet with the functional, but that's not how it works. The faculty are coming and students are coming from every direction, and we are so terrible at providing seamless service to them. I've had a couple of interesting conversations at this meeting about things like Salesforce.com and like how do you implement a system where you can actually track interactions with the patrons so that you can pick up where you left off with someone. I don't know, it doesn't fit with library culture at all. I mean, there are all questions, privacy issues, etc. But that's a manifestation of this really difficult area. So.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. This has been terrific.
I've really enjoyed it, and whenever I speak to you, I always learn so much, so I really appreciate the opportunity.
I really enjoy the conversations. I mean, it's like this sparks things. So thank you very much.
Okay.